Hi, good morning, Susan.
Good morning, Terry.
I want to thank you for doing this. I know my students are going to be thrilled. So I wanted to first ask if you could introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, your title, etc.
Sure. My name is Susan Hardie, and I am the Executive Director of Human Resources here at Chaffey College. And I'm pleased and honored that Terry would ask me to join his class and provide you all with some hopefully helpful information regarding human resources.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks. I know you're
Mhm.
super busy. I really appreciate your time.
Of course.
So I have a list of questions. I'll start with the first one. If you could discuss what challenges you have faced or HR has faced during this pandemic and how you've adjusted.
Good question. We faced a lot of challenges as students have, as you have, Terry. We all have learned to live a new way and work a new way. So some of the challenges specifically with HR is we deal with a lot of confidential information, social security numbers and, spouse names, children names, all of those things that, employee salaries, maybe their medical conditions. So those things are we try and keep those confidential. So we've had to make adjustments in how we transmit information. So for example, it was very common for us to have the social security number on employment paperwork because we would fill it out with the person, with the new hires face to face. Medical information, it was common for us to receive an off work order with medical information noted. So we've had to make adjustments to technology, and we have removed the social security number from all of the employment paperwork. Now we use a different ID number. Medical information, we're having to use the old US snail mail. So we don't have anything that's going electronically. We ask employees to white out the diagnosis or anything that is confidential. We try to avoid people coming to campus. So we're trying to use methods such as the mail. If they have to come to campus, we have them slide it under the door. So we've had to make adjustments due to technology. Another one is signing documents. How do you sign an official document electronically? So we've implemented a couple of measures. We're looking at Adobe Sign right now. For me, though, I like something that's password protected. So I use, I'm not sure the name of the program, but it does allow for an electronic signature that stamps a date. Um,
DocuSign?
doc, no, it's not DocuSign. That's another program that the
Oh,
district has implemented in another area, which we're looking at also. But no, if I can't think of the name of it, but I do have, it's not my signature. It's kind of just a typed name, but it does have a date stamp, and I do access it with a password.
okay.
So I'm sorry, I can't remember
No, it's okay.
the name of that program. So there are adjustments we've had to make. We've had to make adjustments to our working conditions. We only allow somebody to go on campus if it's an emergency in the office, if they need to print to a certain, print a certain contract or need a specific printer. We limit the time, we limit the number of folks. Of course, we all have to have PPE. It has just been a huge adjustment because also HR has to ensure the safety of all of our employees. So, making sure everybody who is working on campus as an essential worker has the face mask, has the gloves, has the sanitizer, that the workstations are sanitized, that the restrooms are so just all of those things that we were always concerned about, but even more, we have a heightened level of concern now because of the pandemic.
Very cool. Thanks, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
For the second question, what's your favorite part of being an HR manager?
I think the thing I enjoy most is knowing that experiencing, I think Terry, you and I came about the same time, but just the level of excitement for people securing the job of their dreams. When they're initially hired, it's very rewarding to see the work of the recruitment process work and pay off, and the best candidate be selected, and perhaps receive the job that they've always wanted, that they went to school with, that they earned their degree for. So that is probably the most rewarding part for me.
Cool. And the most challenging part of your job?
There are a lot of them. You know, HR, we deal with, you know, the best day at work and the worst day at work.
Yeah.
So it's those worst days of, I would have to say, employee discipline. It, it's not a fun process. It's a long process. It's a lot of work. And it's not fun for either party. It's not fun for the district, nor is it fun for the employee.
Yeah. Let's see. For my students, often ask, a lot of, before they go to job interviews, if you have any tips, advice for successful interviews. Also, same question for resumes, and what makes a student or someone stand out. Just three different questions that you maybe.
So, tips for job interview. Be prepared for anything. So, for example, when I came to Chaffey, I was selected for, this was over 20 years ago, but our process is still the same. I was selected for an interview, and I walked in the room, and there was a room of 7 or 8 people. And I had not experienced that because I came from out of state, and we did not have panel interviews. I was used to one-on-one. So I share that with you just to be sure that you prepare yourself. I mean, you may be required on your first interview to do a demonstration of some sort. You may be required to engage in a role play. So for example, if you're going for a job that's customer service focused, they may want to see how you react and how you deal with an irate customers. How is your response? Sometimes, so maybe a little bit testing those soft skills is what I'm trying to say there. So just be prepared. For example, you may be given questions ahead of time to review. You may not. You may go in cold turkey, and they may put questions in front of you, and they want to see how you respond, without preparation. So how do you respond on the fly, so to speak? Be honest. I can't stress that enough. Please be honest. Don't say you did something that you haven't done. And don't be afraid to say, you know what, I haven't ever done that. I haven't ever had the opportunity to do that, but I would welcome the opportunity to learn a new skill, to take on a new task. I mean, that's going to go far, that you admitted in the interview that you had not done that. So, and don't think that's a bad thing, because we know we don't know your experience as well as you do. We see your resume, but when we bring you in, of course you can't be expected to know everything. And so it's gonna serve you well if you have not done something to acknowledge that. But I would say, don't say, no, I've never done that. No, I don't know. You want to show that that you're willing to learn something new. What was the other question? Resumes. Again, be honest on your resume. I will tell you the way it's been my experience in HR that when employers post job announcements, they typically will list the functions that are important, that are performed most for that job. So you want to look at your resume, and you want to make sure that your resume has those functions included, because they're going to be looking for that. So when they're screening the applications, so they're looking through all the applications, and sometimes they have hundreds, you want to make yours stand out. So you want to make sure that if it says strong customer service skills, that your resume and your application reflect those words, and that you have done that. So I'm saying, if don't be dishonest and say you've done it when you haven't. But if you have, and it's strong customer service skills, that's what you want to focus on. If it says ability to adapt easily, give instances where you've shown that you've adapted easily to change. Maybe you got a new manager, and you had to change up the way you had been doing something. So look at those job announcements and make sure that the functions listed are reflected in your resume as well as on your application, because those are the key phrases and words that they're looking for. When they're reviewing 100 apps, they have to they have to pick some things that they have to just focus on, and it's going to be those key job responsibilities. And what makes someone stand out? Know that it's expected that you're going to be nervous, so don't let that discourage you. I mean, let it be. You know, if you're nervous, we're all nervous. You know, most of us are nervous in job interviews, especially when you walk in and there's 8 people in the room. So just, you know, don't let that get to you. I know it's easier said than done, but we do understand, and employers understand when applicants are nervous. What would make someone stand out? I think their ability to engage with the person who's interviewing them. So as the interviewer, when you just make that connection with someone, and you make that through their confidence, through their their experience, and even not so much the experience, but because, you know, speaking of soft skills, you really do need to have soft skills are, if not more important than education, equally as important as education. You can't teach it. It's something you have. You have to have that ability to get along with others, and so I think it's sensing that from someone, that they're easy to get along with, that they're flexible, that they're adaptable, that they're that they have a good work ethic. So those that share stories and experiences about their work ethic, experience that they've had where they've had to be adaptable to change into various situations, that they want to grow with the company. Those are the kinds of things that's going to set somebody out. Yes, experience is important, but they have that on paper, right? They see all that about you. An interview is your opportunity to share those other things, like I just shared about the growth and you know, the soft skills such as adaptability and ability to get along, emotional intelligence, and all of those things.
Thanks, Susan. I know lots and lots of federal employment laws. We have a whole chapter on them. Of all of the federal laws, could you talk about some of the ones that you deal with the most? Tell us a little bit about what the ones that come up more than others. What would you want students to know about those?
Okay. Well, HR, for those of you who are interested in a career in HR is governed by laws. That's all we do, everything we do is mandated by some sort of law. So there are several that come to mind. First is the FMLA, which is the Family Medical Leave Act, and that provides employees with protected leave. While it does not necessarily provide you with paid leave, it does protect your leave. So it gives you up to 12 weeks a year, and it can be taken all at once or intermittently, for leave to take care of an ill family member. That could be a spouse, that could be a child, it could be a parent. There's a list of family members that are covered. And it's protected in that your employer cannot retaliate against you for taking it. So that's what the protection is. Again, it doesn't provide you with anything paid. You would have to use any paid leave that your employer provides you, such as sick or vacation, to remain in paid status, but it does protect your job. It guarantees that when you return, you will return to the same job or that one of equal compensation. Another one that we deal with in employment on a regular basis is the ADA, and that's the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is even, you know, when you're out in public, this is anywhere. When you're at a store, you need to have access. It's all about access. And that means those that may be challenged physically or mentally getting around, that means that they have to have the same opportunities that those of us who don't have those limitations have. So in employment, it's ensuring that the employees or the applicant, it's in hiring as well. It's the employer, the applicant can perform the essential functions of the job without an accommodation. So for example, if they need time, so say you test, sometimes for jobs we test abilities, math abilities, and writing abilities. And so sometimes people, that causes anxiety, and so they may need an accommodation for that. So an accommodation might be that normally we may give 45 minutes for a test. We may agree that an hour and a half is necessary as an accommodation. You know, there are all types of accommodations. There are accommodations for somebody who may have a chemical sensitivity, that we don't do any painting or any type of aerosol spraying around that person. We can have no scents in the office, and so on and so forth. So that's the ADA. And Terry, stop me if you feel if there's more information that you want me to give, or
No,
or
this is great. I
giving
want
too
to tell you,
much.
it's great because otherwise it's, I know my students, the chapter is packed and it's just a lot of legalese and a lot of stuff. So you're
Mhm.
making it come alive. It's great.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. There's Title 7, which talks about discrimination and harassment. California is unique in that California has its own set of laws. So for example, under FMLA, while that may be a federal law, California has its own law, which is the California Family Rights Act. And California is always more generous. I'm going to say always, and I think I mean always, more generous when it comes to implementing acts that mirror the federal laws. So the guidelines are you have to go with whichever act provides the most benefit for the employee or for the individual. So so another one is Title 7, which is the discrimination laws. California has Title 5. So that has to do with discrimination in employment, harassment or discrimination. That's a huge, huge part of my job. Is one, you have to educate the employees on what it is and how to report it and not to do it. You have to ensure that you have processes and procedures in place for investigations. This is something that reaches students. Students have an opportunity as well because there's Title IX, which is also a federal mandate that ensures that students have an equal opportunity for an educational environment that is free of sex-based discrimination. So that's applicable in sports, in the classroom, in your interactions. There's also the FLSA, which is the Fair Labor Standards Act, that guides us for our wage and hours. I think that's several of them. That's not all of them,
Yeah.
but those are the ones that touch my world in the community college, in the public sector.
Thanks, Susan.
Uh-huh.
Let's see. This is a question I've had a lot of students who work maybe in a small restaurant, small venue, and don't have the resources of calling, some corporate number for HR. The question is, what advice do you have for someone who works for a small company and is facing either a hostile work environment or sexual harassment or both?
That's a good question. So just always remember that just because there's not a line to HR, direct line, or a HR office, an individual responsible for this, it doesn't mean it takes away your rights. You always have rights. So absent somebody that you feel comfortable, and I understand a small business, the owner is acting inappropriately, you feel that you're being sexually harassed. I understand, and I know you feel scared, right? You're going to complain to that person? What's that going to do for you, right? They're going to cut your hours. They're going to let you go, that's all retaliation. So it's twofold here. So you need to make sure that you talk to someone that is knowledgeable. That would probably be my first recommendation. And I mean legal counsel. So while you may not be able to afford to go to an attorney, a lot of attorneys, I believe they still do do you know, Terry, they do an hour of a consultation if you have a need, and they kind of let you share what your concerns are. Do you know if they still do that?
Oh, yeah, legal
Okay.
legal aid, yeah.
I know we have Chaffey has legal night, so
Absolutely.
there you go.
Well, when we're not in a pandemic, we have legal night.
Okay. Well, that may be virtual this year. Who knows, right? So there's free legal aid as well. I know Riverside County has free legal aid where you can go in and you can, you may have to wait, but you put your name on a list, and they have attorneys that will provide you with some guidance. I believe Riverside or San Bernardino County, I believe all the counties have this option as well. And the internet can be an option for you too. My only caution would be is just to make sure you're getting sound advice when you're looking, online, searching the web for what to do. So I can tell you what you can do is you can file a complaint. There are government entities that you can file a play with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You can go straight to them. It's the EEOC. They're in LA. They're huge, and their focus is assisting employees who have complaints of discrimination. So you can go there. That would be a call as well, because they may, I think even if you went online, I think they have someone who can guide you through to say, yes, you may have a complaint. No, you don't. So that's also something to remember. So remember, that's the EEOC. So there are some options that are available to you. Those are a few.
Thanks, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Next question is, what advice do you have for an applicant who is interested in working at Chaffey College in any capacity?
So I always say, always remember, you got to start somewhere. You're not going to always start at the top. So for those of you who are planning on pursuing your degree, which I hope you are, that degree may get you a job, but remember, you're not going to start at the top. You have to work your way up. And I would feel that's probably so in any institution. And I think it's good because you want to know that the institution you're going to work for promotes growth, right? And so that's starting at the bottom allows you to grow. I didn't start out as the executive director of human resources. That has been through growth over 20 plus years of work. So my recommendation would be get a position that you feel you're interested in. While it may not be your dream job, you may, you never know what can evolve. So I would say start with something that you're interested in. Start as a short-term worker. That's always a good way to get your foot in the door. And when I say short-term worker, I'm talking about you could do federal work study, or you could do what we have, it's called just a short-term worker. Those are temporary hourly positions, but it gives you experience. It gives you an opportunity to work in an area where you might say, ooh, no, this isn't what I thought it would be, or wow, I have a newfound interest. It also gives the employer, in our instance, Chaffey College, the opportunity to say, ooh, look at this person. This person is a shining star. I can't tell you how many employees, I don't know the number, but it is very common for an employee who is a short-term worker and a good short-term worker or student worker. The progression is usually they go from student worker to short-term worker. And then if they're interested in staying with Chaffey, it's very, very common for our permanent hires to have been short-term workers. I was a short-term worker. So that I don't want to keep comparing myself, but that's my experience, and that's what I'm sharing with you is my experience. So it's very common for people to get permanent positions, and they start through that process. That doesn't mean you can't go straight for a permanent position. There's people get hired that way as well. So I say apply, apply, apply. And while you may not get selected on your first try, continue to apply, and do that with any employer. First of all, they start to recognize your name. They know you're interested. They'll interview you. And I'll tell you what's very common for us is we will interview someone and we've seen that person a couple of times. Well, when we have another position that comes up that we think they would be perfect for, we encourage them to apply. We'll call them personally and say, hey, we have this position. We'd like you to apply. And so you'll become known that you're looking for a job, and they like your skill set. You interview well. We know that, people are nervous, but nevertheless, we still see that you're very interested. You have good skills. You have, the soft skills. It looks like you're a good team player. You're adaptable. You're tenacious. You've shown through your desire to get a job. So just don't give up. Don't get discouraged. It's very common for us to have hundreds and hundreds of applications for a job. So just try again. So don't give up.
Thanks, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. The next one was, let's see, I lost my train here. There we go. Discuss the reasons for multiple interviews and the objective of each level. And maybe you can describe how Chaffey works a little bit.
Yeah. Since that's really my only experience with the multiple interviews, that was all new to me for the public sector here in California. So the first level is really, so the application process, you know, there's going to be, so please remember when you're applying for a job, you must pay attention to the details. If it has attachments and things that you need to include, do that, because if you don't, what's that going to tell? What's the first thought going to be from the HR offices? This person can't follow directions. So please pay attention to the directions, pay attention to the timelines, and upload that resume, upload the reference letters, upload the transcripts. All the things that are required, you need to submit at one time. So once an application is in, it's complete, it's going to go through a screening process. That means all of the individuals that are on the selection committee, it could be anywhere from 3 to 10. We've seen some with 15 people for the higher positions, the administrator type positions. And then they'll screen the applications and they'll rate you. So all they're looking at, if they know you, they're not supposed to use knowledge, but all they're looking at is what's on paper. So you want to make sure you have your grammar's correct. You want to make sure that your application shines, like we talked about earlier, right? That you've indicated the job responsibilities and your experiences on your resume and your application that are reflected in the job announcement. So they're going to screen the application, and then you're going to be invited for a first level interview. The intent of the first level interview is to see if your skill set is what is needed by the department. You know, they want to see if you have the right experience, or if you don't have the experience, do you have some other experience that you could show that maybe is close, or if maybe you don't have any experience. And again, you would say, no, I don't, but you know, I'm willing to learn, or I've done something else that's this, although it's not, you know, maybe that specific experience, but here's something that I can share. So that's what my dogs are getting ready to bark. I'm sorry. Okay. Excuse me. So that's one of the perils of working at home, right? You have children, dogs, doors slamming, people interrupting you, phones going off. So my apologies. So the first level interview is to look at that skill set, and do you have the skill set? Do you have the experience? Do you have the ability to, as that's what you're sharing in the interview? It's hard to see someone's ability in an application, which is why at the interview, you can share what your abilities are. You can share that you're a team player. You can share that you're adaptable. You can share that you have that emotional intelligence and the ability to recognize your emotions as well as the emotions in others and those kinds of things. And so that's the purpose of the first level. Now, the second level is typically with the manager over the area and the vice president or the senior administrator over the area. And that's to see, that's where kind of the good fit comes in. It's your experience also, but it's also, will your work ethic fit? Will your ability to adapt fit? So they're looking more at those types of things, where the first level is looking at your experience. Yes, this is the person we want. They have the experience that's applicable. And the second is, this is the person we want to work at our institution. That's the second level. The third level is with the president. And of course, that's just because he's the president and we want him to have, we want to have his approval for every hire that goes through our system. Not every hire, every permanent hire. These are for permanent positions. Okay.
Thanks, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. What challenges, if any, can you discuss in the recruiting process?
It's always our goal to reach a broad applicant pool. And so because that provides us with a more diverse pool, we feel. So the more far-reaching we can be in our recruitment efforts, we feel that we're going to have an increased number of applicants who have diverse backgrounds. So that's always a challenge. For example, you know, especially for faculty teaching positions, we do go, you know, outside the state of California. We do recruit nationally for those. Those are very sought after positions. It's very competitive. So we do that. for the staff, we don't recruit statewide. We may go county by county, you know, we may be far reaching for the counties, but it just doesn't, it's not reasonable that we would expect a classified employee to relocate, for example, whereas a faculty member would relocate. You know, the levels of compensation are different. The faculty positions are highly sought after. They're a tenure track position. They own their position, so to speak. There's a long story behind that, but they are very, look at Terry. So they're just very coveted positions. So it's not unreasonable to say somebody would relocate for a faculty position. It happens all the time, relocate from out of state. But for our classified staff, we only recruit from the local areas. So the ability to reach a diverse population in those areas can be a challenge. So we attempt to do that by advertising through different websites that focus maybe on diverse populations. We go to the local job fairs that will also maybe be attractive to diverse populations. So we try and implement other ways to reach diverse applicants in the local markets as well. So that's probably the biggest challenge.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is, so what, as someone with your vast experience, what are ways of giving negative feedback during a performance appraisal? What are some ways of doing this in a constructive way? What are some tips? Delivering bad news.
So I think, you know, we all have an area we need to work on. There is no single employee who is, you know, excels and is, doesn't have at least one thing that they need to work on. So I think it's something that as humans, we all need to work on. We have something. I think I think it's important in a performance appraisal to share what they do well, but to also share, and maybe it's not a negative, it's just something to help them grow. I mean, it's all about growth. We want to grow professionally. And so I think you can focus on the need is, you know, if you want to grow, or I can see you growing, but here's an area where I see that you just may need some extra help, and you get their input. It's very common for us to say, how can we help you? In fact, even in the, you may want to consider like a self-evaluation for the employee. That's what we do. And in the self-evaluation, they get to say, you know, this is what I think I would like to do. This is how I would like to grow. Or these are what I need. These are the things I need to meet my needs. So maybe I feel like I need some training in what to do when a conversation with a customer becomes heated. Or I want my Excel skills I want to become more proficient in Excel. You know, I have a coworker who we seem to have some interpersonal communication problems. And so I want to learn how to read her emotions better. I need some help with emotional intelligence. Those kinds of things. I want to be a better team player. So ask the employee, you know, what is it they need? And you can also say, you know, these are our needs, and here's where I see that you're falling short. You know, I would like to offer you training. I would like to give you release time to go take a class. I would like to bring in an expert who's going to share with you and the whole team about this, because this is something others need as well. So I think it's also good that the employee be able to receive the feedback. I mean, that's one of those soft skills that's really important, is receiving the feedback, receiving criticism openly, and knowing, you know, you don't take it so personal that it ruins you, it ruins who you are, defines who you are. It's an opportunity for you to improve, because as humans, we're always improving. I go home at night and say, man, I shouldn't have said that, or dang, I wish I would have done that better. But again, it's an opportunity to learn, and it doesn't define us. And so I would hope that you would always take whatever negative information might be in an evaluation and use it as an opportunity to learn and grow.
Thanks, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
This is our last question. What advice do you have to for students who are interested in pursuing a major and or a career in HR?
Uh, well, I would say that it's a great field. You're always going to have a job. HR is not going anywhere. Even when you think about, a company who is, in the times that we're in, a company that is going to need to shut down or go out of business or temporarily, who's going to be the last folks present? It's going to be HR, because they're the ones processing the paperwork. They're the ones meeting with the employees. They're the ones that are, the liaison between upper management and the business offices or the business operations when it comes to personnel. So I would say that you have job security. It's ever changing. You have to have the ability to multitask. And experience is going to be important. So how do you get that? I get that question a lot. And that's where maybe entering in a lower level position. So maybe it's not even in the HR department, but maybe it's a department that maybe working. So for example, at Chaffey College, if you're working maybe in the dean's office, you get a piece of HR because you are working with new employees. You are scheduling some of the hourly staff. So again, you can always tie some of your functions to HR if you're working with people, typically. So I would take that lower level position and do what you can to learn and grow. There's certificates you can, programs that you can earn a certificate. I can't even think of the name of it right now. Terry, what's it called?
Yeah, I mean certificates. I think no.
No, it's an association where you can earn a certificate. I see it a lot. I don't have a certificate.
HRCMHHS. Yes. Now we're both stuck. Yes, yes.
An employee in my office has it, and I can't think of it. Obviously, I don't have it. And for those of you, you don't think you have to have a master's degree. I have a bachelor's degree, and you don't have to. You can work towards your master's, but there are HR jobs. I'm a proponent of the public sector, where a bachelor's degree with experience is going to get you the job. So start at the entry level. Like we hire hourly employees to work in HR. You're going to start filing. You're going to start doing the jobs that really are the lower level jobs. But again, take that, show your initiative, and move up from there. There are always openings. AC. I was just trying to think of the name of that again. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's I have it here. SPHR, I believe. Yeah, SPHR, Associate Professional in Human Resources. I think.
Okay, yeah. So there are certificate programs. So go and take those. They're offered at a lot of the community colleges, where you take, I don't know, it's minimal amount of classes, maybe 5 or 6, and it gets you this certificate. And you will specifically see that on job announcements where they want this designation. So that would be my recommendation is, again, know that you're not going to start at the top. You may not even get that HR job, the analyst or the generalist job that you want, but start maybe as an admin assistant or a file clerk, and work your way up. It's rare that somebody is going to come out of school with a degree, no experience, and get a chief human resources officer job. You need to have the experience. No matter amount of education for this job, what's going to prepare you is the experience, because you're dealing with people. And that is something it really just has to be hands-on. So it's a process. I was in HR for probably 10 or 12 years before I became a manager, and it was a low-level manager to start. So just keep trying.
Thanks, Susan.
Mm-hmm.
Any last word of advice for my students? Maybe something tailored to working during a pandemic. Any advice?
Working during a pandemic, be safe, number one, but be understanding. This is new for all of us. Be adaptable, be able to pivot on a moment's notice. We have an institution that has well over 22,000 employees, and we were not prepared for this. And so we had growing pains, and we're still having growing pains. So you as students probably experience some of our growing pains. So just know that I think this is unprecedented. We know these are unprecedented times, and so we are learning. And so I think we all need to be patient with each other and understanding, because you don't know what others are going through. You know, people may be short, people may, you know, the whole mask, not wearing the mask again. I mean, it's just such an uncertain time, and just be kind and be thoughtful of others. My recommendation.
Well,
I don't know if you wanted that or if you wanted it relative to HR, but
no, it's great, and any
yeah.
advice is good. I know how busy you are. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Talking about pivot. Well, now this is how we're doing our presentations to the class,
Right,
and
right.
so I want to thank you, Susan, for taking the time to talk to my class this way.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Terry, and I wish you all well.
Thank you, Susan.
All right, take care.